recognition.
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in House Report number 115-665, offered by Mr. Schneider of Illinois.
Pursuant to House Resolution 879, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schneider, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of my amendment, which would help those communities saddled with housing our nation's stranded nuclear waste while the federal government has failed to meet its legal obligation to find a permanent repository. This is something constituents understand all too well. The former Zion nuclear power plant, located on valuable lakefront property in Zion, Illinois, has housed more than 2 million pounds of spent nuclear fuel since the plant's closure in 1998. This waste, situated on the very shores of Lake Michigan, is both an extreme environmental hazard and a severe burden to the quality of life of the residents of Zion, deterring economic investment, depressing home values, and driving up property taxes to fill the void of local revenue. Zion is not alone. Across the country, there are 17 nuclear power plants at various stages of decommissioning, with even more announced closures slated for years ahead. In these communities, plants are typically the largest employer in the area, and when they close and waste is stored on site, it is devastating to the local communities. My amendment seeks to help these communities access desperately needed federal resources until waste is moved. Waste that is quite literally stranded in these communities due to the federal government's inaction. Specifically, my amendment would require the Secretary of Energy to assemble a task force to work across all federal agencies in identifying existing resources and funding opportunities that could assist communities with decommissioning plants where waste is being stored. In addition, the task force would work with communities in the decommissioning process to develop a transition plan to mitigate the economic damage when a plant closes. Communities like Zion, Illinois, have been forced to shoulder the burdens of storage with no compensation in return. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment and help our communities get the federal help they are owed. And Mr. Speaker, at this time I would like to yield 1.5 minutes to my friend, the gentlewoman from Ohio, Marcy Kaptur.
The gentlelady from Ohio is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
I thank my fellow Great Lakes member, Representative Schneider, for yielding the time, and also want to thank the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee, Congresswoman Lowy, for offering this amendment. I rise in support of this effort to help communities that are left with radioactive waste after the closure of a nuclear power plant. The Great Lakes region, I might point out, has no energy umbrella like the Bureau of Reclamation for the 17 western states, or for portions of the South, the Tennessee Valley Authority, that can help communities readjust on a large scale for energy disruptions or changes. In my district of Northern Ohio, the Davis-Besse nuclear power plant is scheduled to be shuttered. We are not waving the white flag just yet, but this community and its people need the tools to cope with the aftermath of what if the worst happens. When nuclear power plants close, the impact on local economies due to the loss of jobs and tax revenue will be severe. For years, the Davis-Besse power plant has provided 700 good jobs and generated $20 million a year in tax revenue for a rural county called Ottawa County, of which $12.1 million each year goes to its school district. That 900 megawatt power plant does more than produce power, it builds community. This major financial support could disappear and leave the community in that entire county struggling to support schools, law enforcement, and roads, and therefore I strongly support this amendment to help these communities adjust as necessary to access federal resources and make a plan for economic revitalization. Thank you, Congressman Schneider, for offering this common sense amendment, one that is so vitally necessary, especially across the Great Lakes region, which is so often neglected. And I want to thank Chairman Shimkus and Ranking Member Tonko for their leadership as well, and urge my colleagues to support it.
Time has expired. The gentleman from Illinois reserves time. What purpose does the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I rise to the amendment, although I will not oppose the amendment.
Without objection, and the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate my colleague from Illinois, one of those Chicagolanders that I talk about, for bringing this amendment. And I use his district, and I've used it for years to talk about the challenges that we face if we do nothing. And this authorization bill is designed to start doing something, and actually it's designed to help us comply with the law that's already written. Zion is the perfect example of the need to move to spend nuclear fuel to an interim site and then a final geological repository, thus freeing up, obviously, great lakefront opportunities on the Great Lakes for redevelopment that would help this community that suffered further closure. So I'm glad you're here. I appreciate the amendment. And I'm going back to what Mark Sanford said. This is a national problem. We need a national solution. That's what we're trying to do now in a bipartisan manner. And good job. Thank you for offering the amendment. And I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would now like to yield 1 minute to my friend and a co-sponsor of this amendment, the gentlewoman from New York, Nita Lowey.
The gentlelady from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schneider, for working with me on this very important amendment. Indian Point Energy Center in my district is scheduled to cease operations in 2021. When the plant closes, the village of Buchanan will be left with a large amount of stranded nuclear waste on site. This amendment would help Buchanan and the town of Cortland access vital resources for economic redevelopment. Until the Department of Energy takes title to nuclear waste and removes it from our communities, the federal government must do all it can to support these de facto interim storage sites. I urge adoption of the amendment and yield back.
Thank you. I reserve it. Can I ask how much time I have left?
Gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schneider, has 30 seconds remaining.
Thank you.
And he reserves. Gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
And I have the right to close. I'll reserve. Reserve.
Well, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schneider, has the right to close.
Okay.
So the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, is recognized. I
would thank the gentleman from Texas. Appreciate his support. And would just, again, just highlight, I would thank my colleague. I don't know if you were in the chamber when I mentioned Chicagoland has 55 million visitors and 10,000 metric tons of spent nuclear fuel. We'd like to solve that problem. Your amendment helps the communities as we transition. It's additive to the overall bill. I'm happy to support it, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back, and the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schneider, is recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr.
seconds.
Speaker, and thank my colleague from Illinois for your hard work on this and your support. I yield my last 30 seconds to my colleague from New York, Mr. Paul Tonko.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 30 seconds to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman from Illinois for yielding, and I stand in support of the amendment. I thank the gentleman from Illinois and the gentlelady from New York for their hard work on the amendment and for the sensitivity shown the people in host communities for our nuclear facilities across our country. With that, Mr. Speaker, I support this amendment and encourage our colleagues to do likewise. With that, I yield.
And the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schneider.
Thank you. I appreciate all the support. I appreciate the work of my colleagues. I urge all of my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. The questions on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Illinois. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.